The first thing I remember is the weight of the door, stone-framed, timber-scarred, tilting just enough to cough up a breath of air that hadn't seen sunlight since Truman was in the White House. It smelled like machine oil and old paper and something sweeter beneath it like dried apples left too long in a cellar. A typewriter waited 6 feet in ribbon-brittle carriage set mid-sentence as if a pair of hands had stepped out for a moment and never came back. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I wasn't supposed to be the one peering into a forgotten room halfway up a mountain. My days of kicking doors were long behind me. On paper, I was there to double-check how the team boxed fragile finds temperatures, foam density, whether a cracked ceramic shard got the right label. That's the work I like in this season of life, quiet, precise, and finished by supper time. Still, when the call came from my friend Lauren about a survey in the Andes, I packed a fleece, a pair of broken-in boots, and the old leather notebook I've had since I was 22. I've learned that when you step into thin air above 8,000 feet, your lungs remember every mile of your life. The mountains make you honest. We came in on a rough road that rattled the fillings in your teeth and ended without ceremony at a fence line held up by crooked posts. Ahead of us, the slope climbed in long shoulders covered with dark pines and a fur of moss that seemed to drink the light. The plan for the day was simpler than the altitude made it feel: walk a grid flag, anything that looked like a worked stone or a cut older than the current trees. In that region, you can sometimes follow old trade paths by the scars they left behind: stair-stepped rock, a series of flat stones, spaced a stride-apart lines that don't make sense until you see how they point to water. Lauren set pace at a steady 2 miles an hour, the kind of speed that keeps you warm without cooking your legs. Mark took the right flank with his camera zipped inside his jacket to keep the battery from dying in the cold. I walked center with the measuring wheel and an orange tape clipped to my belt. The wind came up over the ridge like it had a job to do, constant dry about 20 miles an hour and dropping the air down into the 40s. It carried a clean resin smell off the pines, and every so often something metallic I couldn't place, as if a tool had rusted so thoroughly the air learned it by heart. You get to know a place by the way it sounds when you stop. In that valley, silence wasn't silent. It had layers wind in the needles, a creek somewhere you couldn't see, and now and then a small rock rolling exactly 3 feet before the moss swallowed it. When the cloud lifted, we could make out a distant line of granite bluffs, gray as old pewter 2 miles off. In a different life, that kind of view would have kept me standing in place until the light changed. But we had a grid to clear and marked our points like a slow metronome flag whistle record. I first met Lauren in Utah 15 years back, working a site that turned into nothing more than a scatter of broken clay and a rattlesnake that owned the shade under our truck. She's the kind of lead who notices who hasn't had water and makes them drink in front of her. That morning she handed me a thermos at a break and asked if I still took my coffee like an old man. Black and quiet, I told her. She laughed and said I hadn't changed. Out here, small kindness is a currency. It keeps people from doing something foolish when the mountain gets mean. Mark was different city-minded, always scanning for a shot that earns the day. He'd worked forest fires and Midwestern floods, and he carried weather in his stance. He walked a half step behind and to my right, clicking notes into his phone with a gloved thumb whenever the wind dropped enough for dictation. "You hear that?" he asked at one point. I just lifted my chin. The mountain sounded like the inside of a seashell. "No," he said under it. And then I heard it, a thin hum that wasn't the creek and wasn't the wind. It came in waves like a radio left on in another room, too faint to pin down. I chalked it up to altitude, playing with my ears, and kept moving. This is the part where I tell you what days felt like before we found the door. In town, mornings carried wood smoke and coffee, and every storefront along the main street had a bell that told on you when you came in. You could stand on the corner with a view of the lake and know the time by how the light fell on a paint-chipped bench outside the bakery. Men with hands like shovels traded jokes over donuts, and the woman at the hardware store knew which screwdriver you meant when you said the smaller big one. That rhythm, once it gets inside you, becomes the measure by which you feel safe. We worked that grid for 3 days, up and down, across and back, mapping the slope in rectangles like a quilt you sew from the bottom up. On the second day, Lauren found a chip of flaked obsidian hardly bigger than a thumbnail. On the third, we flagged a series of stones sunk into the ground at regular intervals, flat as breadboards, and just proud of the moss. They faced east, then curved where the hill turned and put us on a line that felt intentional. You can tell the difference between a way and a wandering. This was a way. That same afternoon, Mark called me over to an ash ring he'd found under a lip of rock, a shallow half-moon tucked out of the weather. He brushed loose dirt with the back of his hand and brought up the corner of a label from a tin ink bleached, and the paper soft as cloth. English letters. Not ancient, not even particularly old, but it doesn't take much to shift the gravity in your gut. If a place you're certain should be empty turns out not to be, your body knows before your mind does. You start to notice the way the moss is lighter near one particular boulder, or how the soil has sunk a little in a straight line instead of a natural dip. It's like seeing the outline of an old house in field grass after a hard frost. I didn't sleep well that night. The room had a thick quilt and a small radiator that made a clicking sound, but the mountain had come home with me. I lay there listening to my breath, thinking about the hum Mark heard and the line of stones stepping east like a whispered instruction. When I finally dozed, I dreamed of a corridor that wasn't mine, the kind with narrow windows, nothing to look at but fog and a chair beside a desk where the legs had chewed grooves into the floor. Dreams like that don't scare me. They just fix themselves to you like a burr. The next morning, the air tasted sharper, colder by 5 or 6 degrees, and the wind came from a different shoulder of the ridge. We split the day's grid 3 ways. I took the high line along a stand of old pines that had grown tight together, trunks straight as flagpoles. 90 minutes in my boot clipped the edge of something that didn't give the way a rock should. I stopped, set down my pack, and cleared away the moss with the heel of my glove. A corner revealed itself, stone cut clean at 90 degrees, a face smoothed by time and weather until it shone like a river rock. I called Lauren and she called Mark, and we stood there 3 feet apart, with that respectful kind of quiet people fall into when they step into a church or a courtroom. 10 feet beyond the corner, another showed. You could trace the line between them with your eyes and feel it linking up with others still buried. Lauren measured with the tape, and Mark rubbed his thumb across the stone and nodded like a man who had found a nail head flush with wood. "Let's not rush this," she said, and I felt my shoulders settle. There are 2 ways to break a thing, by force or by speed. We chose neither. We cleared with hands and soft brushes, nothing more aggressive than a wooden pick. As the light shifted, a rectangle took shape roughly 8 by 6 feet, sunk a foot into the ground like the mouth of a well. The timbers that once covered it had fractured and leaned a tired jaw trying to hold a secret. Someone once had built this clean and square. Time had done what time does, softening edges, folding in the unwanted. I've spent a lifetime turning knobs that stick and lifting lids that refuse you twice before admitting you on the 3rd try. I know the sound a space makes when it opens, the way the air changes, how the light rethinks itself. I also know when it's too soon. We logged the coordinates, flagged the perimeter, and closed it for the day, the way you pull a sheet over a patient and promise you'll be right back with the doctor. Back in town, Mark showed me a sequence he'd shot at the ash ring. In one frame, a sliver of metal winked up between pebbles when the sun slipped under a cloud. In the next frame, it was dull again. He wanted to go back after supper with headlamps. I said no. You don't push a mountain after dark. You let it turn its face away and try again when it's ready. He didn't argue, but I could feel his camera buzzing in its case like a trapped bee. People think drama announces itself with horns and a voice from the sky, In my experience, it shows up late to supper and stands on the porch with its hands in its pockets, saying nothing until you invite it in. That evening, the woman at the lodge set out a pot of stew and a plate of rolls that steamed when we tore them. She asked about our day, and Lauren said, promising, then changed the subject to the weather. The forecast called for clear skies and cooler air, good for visibility, hard on fingers. After dinner, I walked the short block to the lake and stood with my hands in my coat pockets until I couldn't feel my thumbs. A heron lifted slow off the reeds and arrowed south long legs, tucked wings working deliberate against the wind. Lights from 3 houses winked on the far shore and made a yellow ladder in the water. Behind me, a truck shifted into gear and eased out of a driveway like it didn't want to wake anyone. I listened for that hum again, the one I couldn't name on the mountain, and heard nothing but the ordinary sounds a town makes when it believes itself safe. I called my daughter from the bench outside the bakery, told her where I was and what our grid had turned up. She said to send a picture if we found something worth framing. I said I would. We talked about her dog and the furnace that needed a new filter and the way the maple in her front yard had finally given up the last of its leaves. After we hung up, I wrote 2 lines in the old leather notebook the way I do when a day deserves a longer memory. Corners in moss. Air colder. Wait. The next morning, frost laid itself over the grass in a white film that cracked under our boots. We reached the flags just as the ridge caught the first light. The stone rectangle held on to the night's cold like a cellar. Lauren set tools on a canvas square and nodded. "We open," she said, and the words put a steadiness in my hands. We cleared more brush, braced the tired timbers, and moved as if the floor itself had a pulse we were obliged not to disturb. That was when Mark turned his head just slightly the way a man does when he hears his name in a room he thought was empty. "You hear it now?" he asked. I did. Not a hum this time. A thread of sound, thin as fishing line pulling from the dark below metal, remembering metal or wind caught in a man-made throat. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could record and prove. But once you heard it, you couldn't unhear it. I felt the hair rise on my forearms under 3 layers of cloth. We paused to drink water breath stacking in small clouds. Lauren looked at the opening and then at the sky, checking the kind of details a leader checks without making a speech about it. Light warmth. Time enough to do this right. She rested her hand on the edge of the stone the way you touch a shoulder before you deliver a hard truth. Slowly, she said, "No surprises." I don't know why I glanced back at the tree line just then. Habit, I suppose. The pines stood close and straight, their tops moving in the wind like a crowd of tall men shifting weight on a church step. No birds, no insects. The kind of stillness you only get right before something changes. I sucked in a breath that tasted like pine pitch and cold iron, and felt the familiar prickle run along the base of my skull, the one that tells a man to pay attention. The pry bar bit wood. The timber sighed and the doorframe gave a small, tired shudder, as if the room behind it was listening to us. We eased back, holding our breath without meaning to, and in that thin moment, every sound of the mountain fell away, until there was only one thing left in the air. The faintest tick of something metal settling in the dark below. We stopped there. Not because we were scared and not because anyone lost their nerve. We stopped because a good team knows when to let a threshold be a threshold for 1 more hour. We logged the time, covered the opening with canvas against stray needles and wind-blown grit, and promised the place we'd step through when the light was a shade kinder. By mid-afternoon, the frost had retreated to shadows, and a band of sunlight lay across the flags like a measuring tape set down and forgotten. We packed our tools quiet, as if a loud zip could wake whatever slept under that stone. On the way down, the wind shifted again and slid a colder blade across the back of my neck. I zipped my collar and didn't say a word, not even when Mark asked if I wanted to hear the plan he'd worked out for first light. Back at the lodge, the porch light clicked on before sunset, more out of habit than need. I stood under it longer than I meant to, hands in my coat pockets, watching the road that runs out of town and up toward the ridge. Somewhere past the bend, beyond the last fence and the last mailbox, a rectangle of stone waited in frost. Inside it, air kept its own time. The phone in my pocket didn't ring. The wind shifted the light on the gravel. And up on the mountain, a room that hadn't had a visitor in 70-odd years held its breath a little longer. When the light came back the next morning, it came slow, an amber wash creeping down the ridge and into the folds of frost that had held through the night. We moved without much talk. There's a kind of quiet that settles over a team when everyone knows something's waiting under their boots. Lauren went over our checklist twice, running a hand through her hair, the way she did when she was steadying herself. Mark had his camera harnessed tight against his chest lens wrapped in cloth. I could hear the zipper on his jacket tremble every time the wind shifted. My own hands didn't feel quite like mine when I laced my gloves. The mountain had changed overnight. It no longer felt like a place for measurement and maps. It felt like it had expectations. When we reached the flagged site, the sun had just cleared the eastern bluff. The frost still clung to the timbers we'd uncovered, each grain rimmed with white. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Lauren crouched, placed her hand flat against the cold stone, and whispered, "All right." I don't think she meant it for us. We began removing the rest of the debris brush first, then the small stones that had tumbled in over decades. The timber gave a dry groan when the first piece lifted. Beneath it, the darkness looked dense enough to touch. A breath of air rose from the gap, cold, stale, and tinged with something faintly sweet like dust and machine oil. It had the weight of a memory. I leaned over the opening with my flashlight. The beam fell into a short corridor lined with rough stone, the floor packed earth. No snakes, no fresh tracks, no sign of animal nesting. Just stillness. "Safe enough?" I said, though I didn't fully believe it. Lauren nodded and secured the safety line to a pine trunk. I was first down. The drop wasn't much, 6 feet maybe, but the air grew thick halfway through. My boots touched the floor, stirring up a cloud that sparkled briefly in the light before vanishing into shadow. The space was small, 10, maybe 12 feet deep, but deliberate. The walls had been fitted, not piled. Lauren joined me, then Mark. His camera clicked once, the flash bleaching the air for an instant. When the light faded, we saw the outline of a table in the corner. It was wooden, eaten through at the legs, but still upright. A tin cup lay beside it, the bottom rusted through. On the table, half buried in dirt, was a pistol, the old kind German make the handle cracked where the grip met the frame. I remember the way Lauren's breath caught. "This doesn't make sense," she said softly. "This isn't colonial. This is 20th century. Mark knelt, brushed off the surface, and brought up a small badge or patch red cloth, white circle, black symbol, faded almost to gray. We didn't say the word out loud, but all of us recognized it. For a second, I felt the temperature drop another 5 degrees. Artifacts are supposed to connect you to people long gone, but this felt different. This didn't belong here at all. Lauren kept her focus on the structure. "There's more," she said, pointing toward the far wall. Half buried beneath a plank was a metal trunk, its surface swollen and streaked with rust. We cleared the dirt around it and pried the lid loose with the flat of a trowel. The hinges screamed like an animal, and a rush of air poured out, damp, decayed, and older than any of us could name. Inside were stacks of paper curled and blackened at the edges. The writing wasn't Spanish. It wasn't English either. She picked one sheet carefully between her fingers, the ink faint but legible in tight, disciplined handwriting. "German," she murmured. "It's all German." I reached in and lifted a smaller bundle wrapped in oilcloth. It was a notebook, leather-bound, the cover cracked and stiff. Inside the first page had a date, 1946. Below it, a single sentence scrawled in narrow script. I didn't recognize every word, but I could make out enough. It said, "They will never find me here." For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the wind pressing against the entrance, a hollow moan that rose and fell like breathing. Mark finally broke the silence. "Who the hell writes that and leaves it behind?" he said. I didn't answer. I was staring at the table, at the way everything had been left, as if the owner might walk back in at any minute. Lauren found her voice again. "Photograph everything in place," she said quietly. "No disturbance until we call in verification." Her tone had changed lower, careful. We worked the next few hours in half-light documenting, bagging what we could lift without damage. The papers were brittle, the edges breaking at a touch. Each item went into a sealed case. We didn't talk about what it meant. None of us were ready to. When we emerged, the sky had gone pale blue, the kind of color that makes you forget how cold it is until you stop moving. I pulled off my gloves, flexed my hands, and realized they were shaking. Not from the temperature, from the weight of what we'd found. I'd spent 30 years cataloging objects of history, arrowheads, buttons, musket balls, but never something that felt this deliberate, this personal. A man had lived down there, maybe for months, maybe for years. And he'd written that line like a challenge to time itself. That evening, we hauled the finds to the base camp and radioed Buenos Aires for clearance. Protocol meant keeping the location quiet until official review. Lauren filed her preliminary note, citing unknown 20th century occupation. We all knew she was understating it, but that's how you protect an investigation. Mark sat at the edge of the fire, scrolling through his photos in silence. The glow from the screen flickered over his face, making him look older. "You think he made it out?" he asked. I said I didn't know. The truth was, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The next morning brought 2 new members from the regional office, an historian and a preservation tech. They joined us at sunrise to reopen the site. With their help, we cleared the rest of the entry and widened the gap. What we'd thought was a small chamber turned out to be the first of several. Behind the main room ran a narrow passage leading deeper into the mountain. The historian's flashlight caught metal at the far end, corrugated steel doors sealed tight and spotted with corrosion. Someone had reinforced them from the inside. It took half the day to clear the debris enough to reach them. When the hinges finally gave, the sound that came out was like the earth exhaling. The air was thick and sour. My throat burned after a single breath. We set up fans to draw it out, then stepped through in pairs. Beyond that door lay something none of us were ready for. A room twice the size of the first, with shelves sagging under the weight of canned food labels written in German script from the 40s. A generator sat in the corner, its fuel tank bone dry but wiring intact. Maps lined the walls. Europe, South America, ocean routes drawn in red pencil. One line started in Hamburg, crossed the Atlantic, and ended right where we stood. Beside it, in smaller script, a single word, Heimat, home. I'd seen field bunkers before, military survivalist, even Cold War fallout shelters, but this one had an order to it that felt military purposeful. Every object had a place. A cot stood against the wall, sheets yellowed but still folded. On a small desk sat a typewriter, its keys rusted mid-stroke. Dust lay thick over everything, but beneath it was the trace of someone meticulous, someone who had prepared to wait a long time. The historian walked a slow circle around the room, reading bits of the maps aloud. These markings. They're strategic, not random. He pointed to a note penciled along a mountain ridge on one of the Argentine maps, Signalpunkt. Signal point. He looked at Lauren, then at me. He wasn't hiding from everyone, he said softly. He was waiting for something. We stood there, our flashlights cutting cones through the dark, each of us silently calculating what kind of man had built this place. The journal came back to my mind, the handwriting, the date, the claim of safety. Whoever he was, he'd been organized enough to plan an escape across oceans, and thorough enough to vanish for good. That night, the wind turned fierce gusts slamming against the tents like fists. I couldn't sleep. Every time the fabric rippled, it sounded like boots on gravel. Around 3 a.m., I gave up and stepped outside. The sky was a heavy gray, no moon, no stars, just the vague glow of snow far off to the west. The ridge above us loomed black. Somewhere in that dark, a man had ended his days believing the world might call him back. I tried to imagine his last winter here, the silence, the static of an old radio fading into nothing. By the following week, the story had started to spread through the provincial office. Word travels fast, even when it shouldn't. We were told to expect oversight from the National Heritage Department. Until then, we continued the excavation. Each day brought more confirmation ration logs dated 1946 to 1962, all signed with the same name, Otto Weiss. The historian recognized it immediately. He was real, he said. A colonel. Disappeared after the war. Hearing that made my stomach turn. The name belonged to a past that most of us only knew from books, but here it was carved into stone and stamped on documents still crisp under dust. It meant we weren't just dealing with a hermit. We'd found the remains of a fugitive, a man who had carried his own version of a war halfway across the world. By the 10th day, we'd cataloged everything we could reach without dismantling the structure. Lauren's voice had gone hoarse from dictating notes. The bunker had become both discovery and burden. At dinner, she said half to herself, "Some places are hidden for a reason." None of us disagreed. Later that night, after the others turned in, I walked back to the ridge alone. The trail was faint under the moonlight, the frost crunching soft under my boots. When I reached the site, I stood at the entrance, the canvas cover billowing against the frame like the lung of a sleeping animal. I crouched and pulled it back just enough to feel the air drift up, still cold, still stale, but different now. It carried something else with it, a note of iron and age. I swept my light once across the chamber. The desk, the maps, the cot, exactly as we'd left them. Only one thing caught the beam, a tin box I hadn't noticed before wedged under the edge of the bed frame. The corner was visible now, maybe dislodged when we'd been working earlier. I should have waited until morning. But curiosity's a hard thing to discipline after a day like that. I reached in and worked it loose. The lid came up easy. Inside was a small stack of photographs, black and white, curled at the edges. Faces, uniforms, gatherings. Men standing beside aircraft, others shaking hands in some official hall. The last photo was different. A cabin on a hillside, its stone walls unmistakable. Our cabin. In the bottom corner, written in the same thin hand as the journal, were the words, Haus Edelweiss. I felt the blood drain from my face. This was no myth, no misplaced relic. The man had built his hideout exactly where we stood, lived here under a new name, and left these things behind like breadcrumbs for anyone patient enough to follow. I replaced the lid, sealed the box, and stood for a long minute listening to the wind. Somewhere in that silence, far off, a sound rippled through the trees. A faint metallic knock, once, then twice, like something swinging loose on an old hinge. It might have been the wind. It might have been nothing. But it held a rhythm that didn't feel natural, and I felt that same prickle at the back of my neck that had followed me since the first day on the mountain. I turned off my light, let the dark close in, and started down the trail. Behind me, the canvas settled back into place with a sigh. The air was colder now, the stars sharp above the valley. I told myself I'd tell Lauren about the box in the morning, that we'd log it properly, that it would be just another artifact, cataloged and sealed. But even as I walked, I knew the story had only begun to show its shape. Somewhere under that mountain, the man we'd found had written a line that time couldn't erase, and the mountain had been waiting 70 years to make sure someone read it. I told myself I'd sleep that night, but I didn't. Every sound outside the lodge carried differently. Now the branches tapping the windows, the slow creak of the roof under the cold. Even the wind had a shape to it, as if the mountain had learned how to whisper back. I lay there with the photo box on the nightstand, the one I'd found wedged under that cot, the one with the word Edelweiss scrawled across the bottom corner. Around 3 a.m, I gave up trying. I brewed coffee in the dark and watched the first light crawl down the far slope. It struck me then that for the first time in my life, history didn't feel distant or dead. It felt close breathing. When the rest of the team woke, I told them about the box. Lauren didn't scold me for taking it. She just looked at me for a long while the way someone looks at a person who's been carrying something too heavy alone. "We'll log it together," she said. And we did. Each photo under proper light, each word in that careful slanted handwriting documented line by line. The historian we'd been assigned, Dr. Havel, a quiet man with soft eyes, sat beside us reading every caption out loud, translating in real time. They were letters and names, coordinates, some we recognized from the maps on the wall. One phrase kept appearing: Das Netzwerk, the network. Havel underlined it each time. "That's not a metaphor," he said finally. "That's what they called themselves." Over the next few days, the mountain turned muddy from thaw. Our boots sank an inch with every step, the air smelling of wet bark and old iron. We widened the excavation cautiously, moving beyond the bunker's main chambers. Beneath a pile of collapsed rock near the rear wall, we found another entry, smaller, half-sealed by time. It led into a narrow crawl space that ran deeper into the ridge. The soil there was colder, the air heavier. It was there, tucked against the stone, that we found the tin crate. Someone had hidden it, well wrapped in waxed canvas edges soldered shut. We carried it outside to open under natural light. Inside were letters over a dozen, written in the same rigid German hand, some dated as late as 1959. The ink was brown and faint, but the words were deliberate. They weren't personal. They were reports. Updates exchanged between men still loyal to a cause that had long since turned to ash. Weiss had been writing to others: officers, scientists, agents, scattered across Argentina, Chile, Paraguay. There were references to meetings, coded names, deposits of material moved by mule across the border. At the bottom of one page was the word Auferstehung. Havel translated quietly, "Resurrection." We sat in silence after that. The fire popped. Somewhere down the slope a bird called, then nothing. Lauren finally said, "So, he wasn't alone." Havel nodded. "No. And he didn't plan to be." Each night after that, the sound of the wind grew sharper, cutting through camp like a warning. I kept thinking about that word resurrection, and about what kind of faith it takes to keep planning a future for something that's already been condemned. Maybe isolation does that to a mind. Maybe it hardens conviction until it becomes its own language. On the 7th day, a courier brought fresh supplies and an envelope stamped with the seal of the Argentine Heritage Ministry. It confirmed what we already suspected: the man in those photos, the one in the immigration records from 1947 under the name Otto Wessel, was the same Colonel Otto Weiss listed missing near Prague in 1945. The proof was in the handwriting comparison and the documents recovered from the bunker. Officially, we had found the most elusive fugitive of the post-war era. The news hit camp like a change in weather. Reporters started calling before we even left the mountain. Lauren tried to keep us focused on cataloging, but the tension was growing. "They'll move in soon," she told me one evening as we packed gear into crates. "Once this story breaks, it won't be ours anymore." She was right. By the time we reached town that weekend, there were already vans outside the regional museum and police posted at the trailhead. In the middle of all that noise, I couldn't stop thinking about one small detail: those fingerprints. 2 of the crates from the bunker had rusted in a way that preserved partial prints in oxidized residue. Forensics in Buenos Aires confirmed they belonged to a man in his 40s, consistent with Weiss in 1947. It was a strange comfort, that scientific match proof that he'd stood there, that these weren't just relics planted by rumor. But it also meant he had touched every bit of that gold himself. We didn't know about the gold yet. That would come later, after the second excavation. For now, we were still wrestling with the weight of what the letters implied. Weiss hadn't been hiding from guilt. He'd been waiting for orders for redemption for a world that never came. That weekend, the locals in San Martin began sharing their own stories. A farmer named Alvarez remembered his grandfather telling of a tall, pale man who lived alone up in the trees, paid in gold coins, and spoke broken Spanish. El hombre del norte, he called him. The man from the north. He'd trade once a season always for the same things. Flour, salt, kerosene. Never coffee, never sugar. And every time he'd come down, children swore they saw strange lights in the woods behind him on his way back. It wasn't superstition. They remembered it because it frightened them. We visited Alvarez's farm that afternoon. He showed us the old ledger where his grandfather had recorded transactions. One entry dated 1952, Otto V. 1 kilo flour, 5 liters fuel paid in coin. The handwriting matched the bunker journal. That quiet little line in a farmer's notebook bridged 7 decades of rumor. Weiss had been alive long after the world forgot him. That night I sat outside the lodge watching clouds move over the ridge. I kept thinking about how easy it is for history to hide in plain sight. A man can live on the same mountain where children play pass within shouting distance of whole generations and still remain a ghost. All it takes is time and a will strong enough to outlast attention. When we returned to the site on the 10th day, a storm had passed through. Branches littered the slope and the air smelled metallic. The ground near the main chamber had shifted slightly, one corner sagging inward where runoff had eaten at the base. We set new supports and cleared the area again. It was during that cleanup that the historian's shovel struck something solid beneath the floor metal deep, larger than the previous crates. It took hours to unearth. The box was heavy, its lid fused by corrosion. When it finally came free, the hinges split, and light caught something dull but unmistakable. Bars of gold. Neat rows of them, each stamped with the insignia of the German central bank. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind in the doorway, low and steady, like it had been waiting for us to find this too. Lauren crouched, brushing dirt from one bar, reading the serial number aloud. Havel's lips moved silently, recognizing something from an old record. "These were supposed to be lost," he said. "Vanished shipments, 1945. The realization came slowly, heavier than excitement. This wasn't treasure. It was stolen memory, the wealth of those who never came home. We covered the find and radioed for officials. Within 24 hours, the area was sealed and soldiers stood where we'd once set up our camp stove. The bunker was no longer an archaeological site. It was a crime scene from another century. Watching them load those crates, I couldn't shake the feeling that Weiss had planned it this way, that he wanted someone someday to see what he'd done and decide what it meant. That evening, over a single glass of whiskey in the quiet of the lodge, Lauren said what none of us had. "He thought he was saving it," she whispered. "Saving the Reich, the gold, the dream. He didn't die hiding. He died waiting." I remember nodding, staring into the amber in my glass. And waiting, I said, is its own kind of death. After the government team left, we were granted one final visit under supervision. The chambers looked emptier than I expected. The air still held that musty weight, but something was gone, the tension, maybe, or the secrecy. Near the back wall where the gold crate had been, we noticed a faint marking carved into the concrete, 5 German words in a trembling hand. Havel translated, "I am waiting for the signal." The words felt like a final prayer or a curse. Either way, it meant he never stopped believing someone would come for him. We left the site before dark. On the way down, I glanced back at the ridge. From that angle, the bunker's outline was invisible again, swallowed by the trees. If not for the flags and footprints, you'd never know a thing had ever existed there. The mountain had gone back to holding its silence. That night, the official cars rolled out of town, their headlights sweeping across the lake road until they vanished in the mist. Only our team remained, 4 of us sitting in near dark. The fire burned low. Lauren closed her notebook and said quietly, "Tomorrow we start the report." But her eyes didn't move from the window. The wind had started up again, steady this time, carrying a faint hum that might have been the pines or might have been something older still listening. When I finally turned in, I couldn't shake that sound. It followed me into sleep, into dreams of narrow rooms and flickering light of a man sitting beside a dead radio waiting for a voice that would never answer. I woke before dawn with the echo of it still in my ears and the uneasy sense that the mountain hadn't finished speaking yet. The morning after that storm, the ridge looked like a wound closing over. The mist had sunk low and everything carried the heavy quiet of something waiting to be decided. We were supposed to head back to Buenos Aires for debriefings, but Lauren changed the plan. She'd gotten word from the ministry they wanted us on site when the forensic team returned with ground-penetrating radar. "One last sweep," she said, her voice flat. I think we all knew she meant it for herself as much as for them. So we went back up the slope, following the same narrow trail that had started to feel like the spine of an old secret. The military trucks had left tracks in the mud deep enough to hold puddles that reflected the sky. By the time we reached the clearing, the wind had picked up again. The metal scaffolding we'd left for support had toppled over one beam lying crooked against the stones. Lauren and I set it right while the techs unloaded their cases. The machines hummed to life, sending low pulses into the earth's soft mechanical heartbeats under the wind. I stood back, hands in my pockets, watching the monitor flash. The line of color moved smooth for a while, then broke jagged, uneven, like something underneath didn't want to be seen. It was the third pass that made everyone stop. The technician looked up and said quietly, "There's a void. About 20 feet downslope." He showed us the display, an anomaly roughly human length. Lauren gave a small nod, the kind that says, "We have to look even if we shouldn't." We marked the spot maybe 30 yards from the main chamber near a cluster of moss-covered rocks. The soil was loose, disturbed at some point long ago. We started digging mid-morning. The air got colder as the pit deepened and the smell changed earth to clay to something faintly metallic. By noon, a flat stone slab emerged, split down the middle. I brushed it off with the back of my glove. The crack ran straight through roots, curling into the seam like veins. "Could be natural," I said, though I didn't believe it. Lauren didn't either. She called for the forensic lead, a woman named Ortega, who crouched beside us and ran her fingers along the edge. "This was placed," she said. Then time took over. It took the rest of the afternoon to lift that slab. When it finally gave, the air that came out was cool and dry, touched with the faint sweetness of decay long finished. Inside, wrapped in what was left of a coat, were bones carefully arranged, not haphazard. A belt buckle still clung to the waist, the metal etched with the faded outline of an eagle. The uniform fabric had gone threadbare, the insignia almost gone, but not enough to erase what it had been. The sight froze the air around us. Nobody said the name out loud, but we all knew. They exhumed the remains slowly, reverently. Each bone laid out under a tent lit by lanterns, the light flickering over tools and notebooks. I stood just outside watching Ortega work. "Male, late 50s, she murmured half to herself. "European origin." She pointed to a fracture at the base of the skull, a small round opening too precise for weathering, too clean for time. "Not an injury from falling," she said softly. "Could be a bullet. Could be self-inflicted." Her tone held neither accusation nor pity, just the weight of observation. When the DNA results came back weeks later, the answer was exactly what we feared and expected. Otto Weiss confirmed within the limits of degradation. It should have brought closure, but instead it deepened everything. The journal's final line echoed in my head. "If they come, I will not be taken alive." Standing at that site, I realized he'd kept his promise. The ministry classified the area immediately. Overnight, the mountain became a restricted zone. Soldiers strung bright tape across the path where we used to walk at sunrise, and the sound of their boots replaced the whisper of wind through the pines. The gold was hauled out under guard, each bar cataloged, photographed, sealed. It was strange watching them load the same boxes we'd lifted from dust and silence, now under halogen lights and cameras, history being turned into evidence. We followed the aftermath from the sidelines. Investigators traced those ingots back through ledgers and wartime archives, shipments taken from banks from families who never had a chance to claim them back. The moral weight of it was crushing. I remember sitting at the lodge that night, staring at my hands, realizing they'd held something that had once belonged to the dead. Lauren said, "We touched their ghosts." I didn't answer. There wasn't anything left to say. In Buenos Aires, the story exploded. Headlines called it "The Nazi Colonel's Gold and the Hidden Reich of the Andes." The public saw mystery and money. We saw tragedy carved into stone. Historians flooded in, and soon the discovery turned political arguments about Argentina's past, about complicity, about how many others had slipped through the same cracks. Files surfaced showing that Weiss had been on early intelligence watch lists, quietly shelved during the Cold War. Maybe he'd offered information. Maybe he'd simply outlived the interest of those who should have cared. Either way, his silence had been bought, and it had lasted almost 80 years. Back at the ridge, the forensic team continued their sweep. They found smaller traces, spent cartridges, fragments of old radio parts, even a decayed suitcase half filled with currency from half a dozen countries. Each item was a sentence in a language of paranoia. Weiss had been waiting for an order that never came. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that his isolation wasn't punishment, it was preparation. He believed he was part of something that would rise again, and somewhere in that delusion he must have realized the call wasn't coming. The days blurred after that. Meetings, interviews, statements to officials. I learned to say the same phrases over and over. Yes, we documented everything. No, we didn't remove artifacts. Yes, the site was intact when we arrived. The words started to feel rehearsed hollow. What none of those forms captured was the feeling of standing in that bunker, hearing the mountain exhale for the first time in decades, knowing we had opened a door that could never be closed again. By spring, the remains had been transferred to a government lab for final analysis. I didn't go. I'd seen enough bones in my years as a ranger, but none that carried history like that. Instead, I returned to the town alone weeks after the press moved on. San Martin had gone back to its rhythm, shopkeepers sweeping stoops, fishermen dragging nets at dawn, children chasing dogs through the plaza. You could almost believe the world hadn't changed, but it had. The locals spoke of the discovery with a kind of resigned awe. El Fantasma, they called him, the ghost. Some said they'd seen the pale light on the ridge at night, the way fog catches moonlight in the trees. Maybe imagination, maybe memory doing what it does best, filling silence with story. I hiked up once more without permission early enough that no one would stop me. The path was damp and slick moss, grown thick over the stones. When I reached the clearing, the entrance had been sealed, fresh concrete poured over the old doorway, a steel plaque embedded at its center. I wiped away the dew and read the inscription in 2 languages. May silence never again protect those who flee from justice. Below that, smaller words. For the dead. For the living. For those who remember. I stood there for a long time. The air had that same metallic tang it always did after rain. Somewhere above, a hawk circled its cry, thin and distant. I thought of Weiss down there alone in the dark, listening to the static of a dead radio, convinced the signal was still coming. And I thought about how easy it is for conviction to turn into madness when it's left to echo in its own chamber. When I finally turned back toward town, the sun was just climbing over the peaks. The forest was waking woodpeckers, tapping water dripping from the pines. For a moment, the mountain seemed at peace, like it was reclaiming itself. I wished it could stay that way, but history doesn't rest. It waits. That night, I got a call from Havel. His voice was low-tired. "There's something you should know," he said. "They're re-examining one of the letters from the tin box. There's a map drawn in the margin north face of the ridge near an old logging trail. Something marked with a cross." I didn't speak. He let the silence stretch before adding, "We think he buried more than gold." The line crackled. I looked out the window at the black outline of the mountains, the faint glint of frost on the trees. Somewhere up there the wind moved through stone and pine the way it always had. It carried no voices, no radio signals, just the steady breath of the world turning. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that the mountain wasn't finished with us, that it still had one more story left to tell, waiting beneath the roots and the rocks for someone willing to listen. It was 2 days after Havel's call when I went back up the ridge for the last time. The air was sharp enough to sting my lungs, and a thin layer of frost had turned the trail into glass. I told myself I was just going to look to confirm that what we'd done up there had finally settled. But I think deep down I knew I wasn't ready to let it go. The government had sealed the main entrance, poured concrete over the doorway, and placed that plaque in both German and Spanish. It looked solid, permanent, but mountains have a way of keeping secrets even when men try to close them. The path wound through the same stands of pine and birch we'd walked for weeks. I could still picture the flags we once planted in neat lines and the small fires we built to fight the cold. The only sound now was the soft crack of frost underfoot. When I reached the north face, where the map from Weiss's letter had marked a cross, the ground sloped gently toward a ridge of darker soil. Someone had already been there, an official excavation quiet and efficient. The patch of earth was filled back in, smoothed flat, a small wooden stake marking the coordinates. Whatever had been buried there had been found. I didn't ask what it was. Some things stop being your story once they pass into evidence. Word came later through Havel that the second cache held more than we'd imagined, more documents, sealed envelopes, and several bars of gold smaller than the first hoard, all wrapped in a coat. There were letters addressed to men already long dead, written in that same tight script, still waiting for a signal that would never come. It was a strange thought that after so many decades, the mountain still had one last confession to give. In the weeks that followed, the story took on a life of its own. Reporters, historians, even a few filmmakers came knocking, each wanting their version of the truth. Lauren handled the calls for a while, her voice growing thinner each time. They don't want the story, she said, once they want the spectacle. Eventually, she stopped answering altogether and went back to teaching at the university. Havel stayed in Buenos Aires working on the official report for the ministry. He sent me a copy months later, printed on heavy paper, every line cold and exact. It listed dates, artifacts, and forensic results, but none of the silence that filled the air between those findings. None of the weight that came with hearing a place breathe again after 70 years of holding its tongue. Mark left before the winter set in. He said he needed distance before the photographs were released. They'll take the story away from us, he told me over dinner one night. Turn it into something clean. He wasn't wrong. Within months, the images of the bunker, its shelves, the cot, the gold were splashed across television screens and magazine covers around the world. People argued over what it meant, a hidden fortune, a monument to guilt, a relic of ideology. But the truth was quieter. Weiss hadn't built a fortress. He'd built a tomb. He just didn't know it yet. For the families who came forward, the descendants of those who'd lost everything during the war, the recovery of the gold meant something tangible. There were ceremonies, restitution agreements, and a new wing planned for the Memorial Museum in Berlin. I was invited to the dedication but didn't go. I didn't want to stand in front of polished glass and see my reflection mixed with his artifacts. Instead, I sent a letter. I wrote that history isn't found in objects, but in the spaces between them, the air, the silence, the hands that lift them out of the ground. By spring, the site in the Andes had been declared a historical reserve. The army pulled back and the ministry erected a small observation platform overlooking the valley. Tourists could come up with guides now, but they weren't allowed near the sealed entrance. The trail had been graded and lined with stones, the kind that catch the light when it rains. I went up once with a small group of local schoolchildren. They were quiet, respectful, as their teacher told them about the discovery. She spoke of lessons how hatred travels, how memory outlives the men who think they can control it. I stood behind them, hands in my coat pockets, listening to the wind thread through the trees. It sounded almost kind that day, softer somehow, as if the mountain itself was relieved to have its truth spoken aloud. Lauren and I stayed in touch for a while. She sent postcards from fieldwork in Chile, then a letter saying she'd taken a sabbatical. She was studying patterns of post-war migration, connecting the dots between names and places that once seemed unrelated. Every trail leads back to another, she wrote, and most of them end with silence. I knew what she meant. Some stories never close. They just stop demanding to be told. As for me, I retired for good not long after. I still consult occasionally, mostly to keep busy. But there's a line I stopped crossing after Argentina, the line between uncovering history and disturbing it. Every discovery carries a cost, and I've learned that not every truth needs an audience to matter. Sometimes it's enough that it's known. I did return once more a year later on the anniversary of the excavation. The plaque was already weathered, the lettering filled with dust. Someone had left flowers at its base, white edelweiss, delicate and out of place among the dark stones. There was no name attached, just a small card that read for the forgotten. I stood there until the sun slipped behind the ridge. The wind moved through the trees the same way it always had, steady, unbroken, eternal. Standing there, I thought about the man we'd found the colonel, the ghost of the Andes. In the end, he wasn't a legend or a symbol. He was just a man who couldn't live with the world he'd made a man who tried to outlast truth and found only loneliness. His story was a reminder that even the most powerful lie loses its strength when the world stops listening. Later that night, as I walked back toward town, I could see the faint line of the trail behind me, silver in the moonlight. Somewhere beneath that soil lay the last fragments of a life built on control maps, letters, coins, dust. But higher up above the concrete and stone, there was still the sound of wind moving freely through the pines. Time had reclaimed what fear had buried. Havel passed away the following spring. His wife sent me his journal filled with notes and translations from the letters we'd found. On the final page, he'd written a single line in his careful hand. Justice begins when silence ends. I keep that line taped above my desk. On quiet evenings when the house settles and the world feels still, I read it out loud, just to remind myself what it took to get there. It's strange how places can hold both horror and peace in the same breath. The valley looks almost untouched now, green in summer, silver in winter. Travelers pass through without knowing what's sealed beneath their feet. Maybe that's for the best. Some stories are meant to rest once they've been heard. Others keep whispering like the wind through old timber, asking us not to forget. I sometimes wonder if in those final days, Weiss realized that the signal he was waiting for had already come, that it wasn't a message over the air, but the quiet that follows when the world moves on without you. Maybe in that last moment he understood that history doesn't need believers to survive. It just needs witnesses. And we were the unlucky ones chosen to listen. When I left Argentina for the last time, the plane banked low over the Andes, and I could see the ridge stretched out below a long scar cutting through the mist. The clouds rolled over it soft and endless, and for a second it almost looked peaceful. Maybe that's all we can hope for, that the earth in its own slow mercy knows how to turn even the darkest story back into silence. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views or numbers, but so no one's name, no matter how buried, ever gets lost to the dark.